Hello. Hello, Debbie.
Hello. Hello.
Hi. We're just seeing people joining at the moment. Can you hear me clearly?
Yeah, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, brilliant.
Excellent. Okay. Do I need
Um,
to do anything else? I think I'm fine.
no, I think you are fine. Maybe if you can, that's it. I was going to say, just tip this camera ever so slightly.
Let's see.
Yeah, that's it. About that. Perfect.
Okay, that's good.
Hello to everyone joining us. We are getting ready for our Instagram live. Really glad to see people joining. Um, We will get started shortly. Give people a chance to log in and click the button.
Just 1 second. It's asking. Just let me see what happens
Go
here.
for it. Yeah, we'll give it a second before we start the conversation. But thanks everyone for joining. It'd be really cool to hear where you're joining from as well. Do add a comment into the box and let us know where you are, where you're joining from. And we are going to talk today about racism in the anti-slavery movement. So, Debbie, are you set?
Absolutely. Good
Fantastic.
to go.
Okay, let's get started. And good to see people here. We're going to also upload this video, so it'll be available to view afterwards on YouTube. So if you can't stay for the whole time, that's fine. I'm Joanna, I'm the Executive Director of Freedom United. Delighted to be hosting this conversation today with Debbie Ariyo from BASNET, which is the BME Anti-Slavery Network. And BASNET has been shortlisted for under the Reducing Vulnerabilities Anti-Slavery Award, which will be given out on Anti-Slavery Day in the UK, which is Monday. So ahead of that day, and we're having a conversation to explore how racism limits our ability to have an impact on preventing trafficking, supporting survivors' recovery, and also how it's limiting survivor leadership in the movement. So for Freedom United, those of you who know us will know that we are looking to for a world which is resilient to modern slavery, and that does require some radical change in policies, practices, and behaviours throughout society. And I think we call ourselves deliberate activists. We recognise that discrimination, not valuing people because of their identity, perceived or otherwise, facilitates society's tolerance of exploitation and effectively allows some people to get away with keeping others in conditions of modern slavery. So to open our conversation, I think it'd be interesting, Debbie, for our audience to hear from you how racism shows up in the anti-trafficking movement.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Debbie Ariyo. I'm the CEO of the charity Africa, and part of our work at Africa is running a network called the UK BME Anti-Slavery Network, BASNET. And so, to be honest with you, just a bit of a background, if you don't mind, Joanna. So BASNET, we set it up because we were really bothered about the lack of representation of affected minorities in the anti-trafficking sector. But since then, the work has really expanded, and I'm talking just less than 2 years. The work has really expanded to the point where we realize that there's so many gaps in the sector. It's not just in terms of representation by community, by affected communities, but when we look at how the sector is set up, when we look at how, for example, the research sector is set up, where the bulk of researchers who are researching anti-trafficking, anti-slavery issues are not from BME communities. Even the key issues affecting different communities are not usually the subject of research. When we look at the policy making sector, the people who are making policies on modern slavery are not from affected communities. And that influences the type of policies that are made in terms of how those policies are able to address the key issues that we're seeing in relation to modern slavery and human trafficking. It's also in how different organizations who are addressing modern slavery and human trafficking actually set up themselves, i.e. in terms of the personnel who are running those organizations, who are leading those organizations, who work for those organizations. The list is endless. We could go on and on, but essentially we have a race problem in our sector. And that's very clear cut. That has been clear cut from day one, and it's still very clear cut to me that we need to have effective change in order to ensure that things can improve.
Thank you, Debbie. I mean, that's a really good opener. And I just also invite everybody who's listening, if you've got comments on what you're hearing or thoughts or questions, please do add them into the comment box and we'll get around to them hopefully we'll have time to get around to all of them in the Q&A section. And yeah, it's a very interesting, it's a very important point that I think is often forgotten, is that actually there's a real, what's happening out there in society is no different from what's happening in other sections of society, like, for example, the anti-slavery movement. And we can't think that just because we have a shared commitment to end modern slavery, that means we also have shared values on other matters such as racism. And I think that's why this is such an important initiative. If you do want to tweet out about anything you hear, we're using the hashtags BME anti-slavery, so one word, BME anti-slavery, and also hashtag anti-slavery day. You can also add 2021 at the end because that's what we're using for Monday. But I think what would be really good to understand is, I know that, as you said, there's been a lot of work and attention put on this issue just in very recent years. So what exactly are the kind of changes that BASNET is seeking to push for? And perhaps give us a bit of background about how you came to setting up this group. And I noticed that in the documentation you found yourself somewhat surprised to be setting up an anti-racism initiative when actually you've been working for 2 decades on an anti-trafficking work in the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it wasn't never ever my intention to set up an anti-racist organization or a network, if you can use that term. I just wanted to work like other colleagues to help address the issue of modern slavery and human trafficking in the UK. But I mean, I guess this is just a natural consequence of seeing the gaps that exist in so many ways. Over the years, and like you said, I feel like I'm part of the anti-slavery furniture because I've been in the sector for a very long time, and the issues remain the same from 2001. That AFRUCA, which is the lead organization for BASNET, which I set up in 2001, is still the main BME organization working in anti-slavery in the UK. In England at the very least, and that has been the case year on year, and it's just not acceptable. Firstly, secondly, when you go to all these important meetings, policy meetings where important decisions are made, the affected communities are never anywhere near those tables, near the doors, talk less of the tables. So they're never involved in any way or form. Thirdly, the people who are making all these policy decisions they do not understand the key issues affecting communities. And that's really very clear cut to me. But if you move away from that and look at the organizations, and these are well-meaning organizations because they do good work, in supporting victims, in helping them to recover, in providing a range of services to meet their needs. But many of these organizations are not actually led by affected communities or even survivors themselves. They're not involved. So we're, I guess, seen as service recipients rather than service shapers. I don't know if I can use that term. We shape the sort of services that are provided to meet our needs as survivors. That's not happening anywhere in the UK. And so for me, I just felt that it was about time to start to address this, to change the status quo, to see how we can improve on this situation. Otherwise, we're going to be saying the same thing in the next 20 years.
Mm.
And I don't think I'll still be around in the next 20 years. At least I don't think I'll still be working in the next 20 years. But it's clear cut to me that if we do not do something at this point, in the next 20 years, we're still going to have the same situation on our hands.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if you think of any other social movement that's made progress on an issue, be it gay rights or civil rights or women's rights, you cannot imagine that that movement has nobody, well, has so few people who are affected in leadership position. And that's what we have in
Yeah,
the
yeah,
anti-slavery space. And I agree. I mean, I think it's the same. It's a crazy situation, and it's not surprising that we still have such a long way to go if actually the people who are most affected do really understand what needs to change, what causes vulnerabilities, who know exactly how systems need to be addressed so that protection is real. If they're not included in the conversation, then it's somewhat it's crazy, to be honest, that they aren't part of the conversation because they're best placed to put the solutions forward and lead the movement. And I think the two things are somewhat interconnected, right? Because actually, if you're struggling to get on with your day-to-day living because of issues of racism, which might manifest in the way that your experience of recovery, then it's not surprising as well that you're not also in a position to be a leader. So addressing racism is also about creating space for survivor leadership, as well as a meaningful, credible, strong, and powerful movement. And I think I call it allyship. I think so. The important thing is that yes, it's not done to people who are survivors, or it's not done to people who are living in affected communities who might be vulnerable to because of the systems that and structures that they're facing. But we should be working alongside them, right? I absolutely completely agree with that. I think it's a really important point. And I think also if we think about beyond the UK, for sure this is not unique situation to the UK. And I know when we were talking before, Debbie, we were thinking about the situation in countries elsewhere around the world, and in particular in the Middle East, where the kafala system, which is the guest worker system, where a migrant worker's visa and their immigration status is dependent on their employer. The way that racism actually facilitates the exploitation of that system to hold somebody in servitude effectively. And no one's holding each other to account. They're not holding each other to account because they think that's okay. They're a migrant worker and they don't deserve better. I mean, really, you've got to look inside. What is the framework that allows people to continue to behave in that way? And Debbie, I know you also mentioned Libya. Do you want to talk a bit about Libya and how racism also plays a part in the slavery that we know that people have experienced in passing through Libya?
yeah. That's a very good question, but I think I would not be able to do justice to it without actually going back in time. So people talk a lot about the transatlantic slave trade, which obviously affected millions and millions of people. But we also need to remember that before the transatlantic slave trade, we had the trans-Saharan slave trade, which even lasted for centuries, a much longer time than the transatlantic slave trade. And tens of millions of people were affected. And so right from history, there's been this relationship between the Arab world and Africa, where, there's always been the trafficking and enslavement of Africans in the Arab world. And we can still see some of the signs up to today. If you go to Basra in Iraq, there's a huge population of the descendants of enslaved people living in Basra. If you go to Egypt, there's so many instances where, the descendants of people who were enslaved are still living in countries like Egypt. So that relationship has always been there, where even in Africa itself, if you look at Mauritania, the relationship between the lighter skinned Arab population and the black population, slavery was very, very legal in the different nuances are still at play in the kafala system in the Arab world. In terms of the slavery we're seeing in Libya, all of these different nuances are based on historical facts. So the enslavement of African people being seen as commodities to be bought and sold. And if you can't buy them wholesome, you can still use their body parts. So not only are people being trafficked and being enslaved in Libya, but there's also the organ trafficking going on, where the people's body parts are being harvested, if I can use that term, and then sold. So I guess all these are based on historical facts. So if you do not address history in terms of the lessons from history, we will not be able to understand what's happening today in relation to the kafala system in the Arab world and what's happening in Libya. So I guess history has a key role to play. We need to go back to history and understand what happened all those centuries ago, and why we're still seeing signs of that in this 21st century.
Yeah, and there's been some fantastic scholarly work on this topic. Eric Williams, in particular, of course, from Trinidad, spoke a lot about the connection between racism and how it came out of slavery, and also how actually racism really has underpinned the recreation, if you like, of slavery into what's now we see in the US in the form of the industrial prison complex. And it's something that Freedom United were very concerned about, and we're campaigning to amend the 13th Amendment of the US Constitution, which is supposedly abolished slavery, but in practice it actually states that slavery is abolished with the exception of a punishment for crime. And we know that the US is a country that incarcerates the highest number of people in the world, and we also know that that incarceration is disproportionately people of color in the US. And the transition from historical slavery to apprenticeship to prison slavery shows you that those connections absolutely exist, as you say, and that what we're looking at today isn't entirely separate from what we've seen in history. I agree with that.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Whatever is happening, even when you look at trafficking to Europe, all these different nuances, when we look at them within the historical context, these are not happening in isolation. This is history repeating itself in a different way, if I can put it that way.
Absolutely. I think, so if we think about some of the organizations that support the anti-trafficking space and who are interested in fighting modern slavery, one of the key actors are funders, right? Because organizations like yours and like Freedom United are very much dependent on donations. And the question is how is the funding actually perhaps, or how could it be helpful in dismantling systemic racism? I think, for example, we don't see much opportunity to fund issues like addressing prison slavery. But of course, there is there is funding out there for specific, maybe more anti-trafficking initiatives that are perhaps, less subject to I think some of the concerns that we're talking about today. But what role would you say that funders have in making sure that we are addressing some of these key issues and make sure that we're really tackling racism at the heart of our anti-slavery policy?
Oh, I think funders have a very, very major role to play in many ways. Firstly, I feel that funders can become a bit more demanding of the people that they're funding. So, for example, if you're funding a major anti-trafficking organization, you should be asking them about, do you have an equality, diversity, and inclusion policy? What does it include? As part of this funding, we would like you to ensure that the people you're recruiting are, a certain percentage of the wider population, a BME population. We want you to ensure that, you're employing survivors of trafficking to do this work. I mean, there are many ways that, funder can put, the people they're funding in that sense to task. But apart from that, funders can also target affected communities by saying, look, we do know that trafficking is a big problem in this particular community, and we want to work with the people in those communities, to address this problem. So we will fund bona fide, genuine organizations in those communities to do particular work. Funders can also target survivors. They can say that actually we recognize that the voices of survivors are very silent in all of this. So we want to genuinely fund groups of survivors to do A, B, C, D, and E to tackle these issues. So, I mean, I guess there are different ways to address it. The funding that's going into the anti-trafficking sector can be a bit more targeted to help address the problem of racism, equality, diversity, and inclusion. Definitely, it can be done.
I think you've given some really good examples as well to any organisations working in the space as to what concrete things they can do. Is there anything that you would add to the list of things you've already mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, we have even funding organizations themselves need to be a bit more diverse, to be honest with you. Because if you have more people from diverse communities who are helping to make decisions about where your funding goes, it will go a long way in terms of being able to properly target affected communities. So I guess, even the funding bodies themselves need to start to look at EDI in their own different organizations and how this might influence how they, they make funding decisions. Definitely.
I agree. I think there's a real opportunity there that would be good to see explored. I think a sort of follow-up question, I suppose, is how would you say anti-trafficking organisations can actively be anti-racist allies in the space? So you're giving us some concrete examples of what they can do, but just to be an ally, what would it look like, and what would we want to see sort of individuals thinking about that are in organisations?
I mean, there are many things. I mean, we looked at some of this in our Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion Action Plan. So, for example, we're saying that, look, if you're an anti-trafficking organization and your service users are from a diverse range of communities, from different ethnic backgrounds, you should try to ensure that the people who make decisions in your organizations, i.e. your senior management, your board members, are reflective of those communities. We even came up with a specific figure, the 1 in 4 figure, i.e. 25% of your leadership should be from an ethnic background. So for example, if you have 8 people, my math isn't very good, so correct me. If you have 8 people on your board of trustees, then 2 of them, which I think is 25%, should be from an ethnic background. And that actually is not too much to ask when you consider
Absolutely.
It's not too much to ask.
It's not.
If you look at the almost every single well-known anti-trafficking charity in the UK today, majority of them, and I would say, when I say majority, I'm looking at 80, 70% of them do not have any black or anybody from any ethnic background on their board, which is ridiculous, to be honest with you. So there is a major gap there. And that's
Yeah.
an area that organizations can easily commit to tackling in the shortest possible time.
And I want to talk about an example that I heard actually in another in the launch event for BASNET, which I think just really explains why that's so important and the kind of difference it makes. And I can't remember if it was you who talked about it, but the example was around survivor support and the fact that how that's received. If it's received in a voucher and the voucher can only be used in certain shops, then those shops obviously tend to be the chains, because of course if it's a national scheme, that's the most practical. And then there's a real limitation then to what's available to buy. Now, if you are somebody who's come from another country, you've gone through a horrific experience and you're trying to recover, look after yourself and move on in your life, and you just the opportunity to be able, and down the road you have a shop which sells food that you enjoy, that reminds you of better times. How crazy is it that you wouldn't actually be able to buy that, even though you have the support at hand? But people don't even think about it, right? Because if they're not thinking about, other needs and other interests, then that observation isn't even noticed. I mean, is this the kind of thing that we're talking about?
Absolutely, and that's why we're saying that anti-trafficking, service providers should have a comprehensive EDI action plan to kind of like tease out all the key areas of their work and how they can ensure that those different aspects are EDI compliant, if I can use that term. So it will only take somebody who doesn't understand the needs of somebody from a different culture, a different country, to actually have a policy where you have this payment card that you can only use in Sainsbury's or Tesco, when the food that you eat is not sold in Sainsbury's and Tesco, which means that you're forced to buy food that you don't enjoy, that you don't like, which obviously compounds your well-being as somebody who is recovering from a terrible ordeal of trafficking and slavery. So, and that's what we're saying, that representation matters in so many different ways. And until organizations can start to put that in place, then it would take a long time for us to be EDI compliant in our sector or within our movement. It means that we're not really taking into account the needs of those people that we claim to be helping or to be serving.
Absolutely. And we actually have a question which ties into this around service users and what they actually, and what they want, what kind of practical changes they would want to see. So, I mean, that's such a concrete example, but I imagine there's other things that you hear come through that service users are saying, actually, I'm trying to recover, and these are some of the things that are making it really difficult, and these are some of the things I want to see changed. Are there some other specific examples that you could share?
Oh, there are examples. There are examples in relation to accommodation. There are examples in relation to, we had, a service user, and this was not even Africa service user. It was just somebody who contacted us because I guess they didn't know where else to go for help and support, because as a young Muslim girl, they've been placed in accommodation with men, and it wasn't, as far as they were concerned, it was not suitable accommodation for them. They had to share toilets and bathrooms with men. They had to share the kitchen with men, and they just found themselves very vulnerable, especially because of the experiences that they had of sexual exploitation. And so, I guess that is another issue in relation to how do we ensure. To be honest with you, when we talk about equality, diversity, and inclusion, as far as I'm concerned, this is just common sense.
Yeah.
It is common sense to me in relation to how do I ensure as a service provider that this person that I am supposed to be looking after, I can help to meet all their needs, make their life as easy as possible, make their recovery as easy as possible. That's what we're talking about. And so, you think about these different issues that could come up. We've talked about food, we've talked about accommodation, we've talked about understanding people's religious beliefs and practices and ensuring that we can help them, to conform to their religious dictates, because that's what we should be doing. We should ensure that the people that we're supporting, can have access to everything they need to make their lives as easy as possible. It shouldn't be rocket science, and it shouldn't be hard to do that. And we don't really, yeah, it shouldn't be hard to do that, definitely.
I think I really like the way the way you've framed it as common sense, because
It is,
I think, people hear like, diversity, equity and inclusion, and they think, oh, I think some people might think, what is that? What does that entail? Like, and they feel a bit intimidated perhaps by the language and, the terminology. But really what you're talking about is simple common sense. It's just,
absolutely.
And that common sense is thinking about, who is it that we're trying to work to help? And are we in the best position possible to understand their needs to be able to help them? Right?
Absolutely.
And
that's simple.
That's all we're talking about, in fact.
Yeah, it's that simple. So if your service users are from Nigeria, of course you're not Nigerian. You possibly don't know anything about Nigeria. You need to be finding out, what do I need to know about my service users so I can make their lives as easy as possible? And it's that simple. It could be in terms of the food that we provide them. It could be in terms of how we allow them, to express themselves in terms of their culture and their cultural practices. And it could be in terms of how we enable them to further education, make it easy for them to further their education. Because for many of those young people, education is extremely important. And in fact, that's why they became vulnerable to being trafficked. There's so many different nuances to it. So that's why I said it's pure common sense, because as a service provider at Africa, that's what we do. When we have sessions with young people, we do not give them sandwiches, for example, because we know they don't like sandwiches. We give them food that we know they will like, which is, for example, jollof rice. And you can't go wrong. You cannot go wrong with jollof rice. If you're working with young people from Nigeria, it's just common sense, and they love it. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, it's essential to find out. If you do not know what to do, ask them, ask these service users. That's why you're there, to meet their needs, not to impose what you feel needs to be done, but to actually talk to them. And I like the phrase you use, you call them allies. So be allies to your service users. How can we make your life easier? We're not going to solve all your problems, but how can we make it easier? That is the whole point of having an equality, diversity and inclusion policy within organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think having people in positions like on boards and within organizations who would naturally know some of those things, like, for example, people are not likely to like sandwiches, let me not order in sandwiches for food. But clearly there's some other barriers, because actually if we listened well, then we would solve some of these problems. So what's actually stopping, what are some of the barriers? I mean, is it that service users are just not being heard? There's no way for them to express their concerns? And I have to apologise as well, because I think there's quite a bit of background noise at the moment.
No,
there's some activity going on out in the street, but I hope it's not interfering too much. But yeah, on the question of service users and their ability to get change to happen, and I definitely don't want to put the onus on them, and it shouldn't be. It absolutely shouldn't be, But clearly, when there's something that people want to have done, is there a way for them to what kind of things are stopping them from seeing it happen, that change happen?
Well, you mean service providers?
Yes.
There really should.
Sorry, users. Pardon me. I mean
service users.
Yes, pardon me. I mean,
we're talking about young people who have been through so much in their lives. Don't forget, we're talking about victims of, human trafficking and slavery. People who are, unfortunately, they've been subjected to a lot of control, a lot of oppression in their lives. These are the young people that we're talking about. And when you now find yourself as a recipient of services, unfortunately, you might feel obliged to just take what's given to you.
Mm.
You feel that you have to be grateful because at least they're trying to help me. So I feel grateful. But it shouldn't actually be like that. They shouldn't have to feel grateful for whatever service we're providing. They should be able to receive the best service possible that will take account of their individual needs, as people who are trying to recover from some terrible things that have been done to them. And that's the reason why we are setting up organizations to help. And so as helpers, we should be able really to think through very deeply, how can we make the lives of our service users better? That's where EDI comes in. And so again, I keep saying it, maybe the terminology, if you can find another terminology that will help, but essentially is about ensuring that we include them in decision making, that they're represented in terms of how the organization is run, that we take account of their specific needs, their cultural needs, their religious needs, even if, their needs, if they're LGBTQI, just to make sure that by being with us, we're here. It's very obvious that we're here to help them, to support them. And so, as far as I'm concerned, that really should be how organizations should function in our sector, within our movement. We should be there to care for people who have been through so much.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what about the issues that are outside the power of organisations? So, for example, kids who are caught up in county lines. I mean, they're disproportionately young men of African heritage, and they're often criminalised, right? So,
Yeah.
what kind of changes do we need to see to have them recognised as victims of exploitation and not criminals? I mean,
I'm sorry.
what can we
Yeah.
do? Is that something that BASNET is looking at?
Definitely something that we're looking at, and the government is currently reviewing its bill, the Nationality and Border Bill, and there are clauses there that actually we feel might disproportionately criminalize doubly criminalize young people from BME backgrounds who are not British citizens, but who have been caught up in county lines, including deportation. We're already seeing young people being deported after serving a particular sentence. And so there's this focus on influencing policy to make the policymakers understand that actually, where by doing this, we're putting in place a racist, law that would discriminate against a particular group of people in the country, BME people, young people. And so it's trying to influence policy in that way by making government understand what's happening, what's wrong with the policies that are being crafted. So I guess there are a number of working groups that have been set up to try to influence government in that sense. But we're on some of those working groups at BASNET Africa. And again, more representation is required to be able to pressurize government to be able to do the right thing. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that, yes, of course, there's some work being done, to tackle that, but we do need more representation. We need more people around the table to be able, to push government to do the right thing in relation to policy on different aspects of trafficking and modern slavery.
Yes, absolutely. Are there any other questions from anyone who's watching? I think we've covered quite a lot of ground in our conversation, and clearly there's a lot of work for BASNET to be doing and to work on. And I want to just invite any questions before we bring this conversation to a close. But I hope this is one of many conversations that we'll have on this topic. And, we will be sharing this, as I mentioned, on our social channels. And please do share this conversation with your networks. and it'll be on our Instagram live and sorry, on our IGTV, I think, and also on YouTube. Well, I think a big thank you, Debbie, for your time and for your amazing work. We'll
Thank
be
you very much.
keeping an eye out on Anti-Slavery Day to see Ernst the award that you deserve for your great work in this area. And we
Thank
hope
you.
to continue to be deliberate activists as allies as anti-racist allies in the anti-trafficking, anti-slavery movement.
Thanks, Joanna. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And take care, Debbie, and take care, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.